Chapter 4. The Duplex Mental Organism. Having now stated in general outline the fundamental principles of mental medicine and shown the universality of the law of nature under which is made possible the healing of the nations, it remains to deal more in detail with the fundamental propositions which constitute the basis of scientific mental healing. This becomes necessary for the reason that success in mental healing by scientific methods is best promoted by first acquiring a clear understanding of the law under which the healing is effected. In other words, scientific methods require scientific knowledge for their successful application. It is scarcely necessary to observe that this is in violent contrast to the conditions required for success in mental healing by the unscientific methods to which we have alluded in the preceding chapter. Obviously, a knowledge of science, or a capacity to reason, would handicap a healer who practices by methods involving an unscientific theory of causation, especially one that involves the insensate denial of every fact of human experience. Nevertheless, faith is as essential to success in healing by scientific methods as by any other. But there are three advantages in this regard which are incident to scientific methods. The first is that the requisite faith can be acquired by study and reasoning. The second is that the faith is perfect, for the reason that it is acquired through knowledge and confirmed by reason. And the third is that the faith thus acquired and sanctioned becomes at once a permanent possession, because there can arise no adverse autosuggestions from the objective mind to weaken its potency. It becomes, therefore, a matter of the first importance for the healer to be well grounded in the fundamental principles underlying the science which he proposes to utilize, for he should be able to instruct his patients in its fundamentals, to the end that he may be filled with the same kind and quality of faith that the healer possesses, the faith born of knowledge of the law, and not of blind credulity. Otherwise, he would enjoy no advantage not possessed by the fetish worshipper. I shall, therefore, dwell at some length upon the evidence demonstrative of the truth of each of the terms of our hypothesis, and incidentally upon some of the practical uses of the law in affairs of everyday life. First, then, of the duplex mental organism. Everyone who has had a dream has in some measure realized the duplex character of his own MMD. He knows that the brain is the organ of the mind of ordinary waking consciousness, but he knows that in sleep the brain is quiescent, that, in fact, sleep is the condition in which that organ rests and recuperates. Yet he realizes that during that period of brain rest there is a mental energy and evidence that seems to act independently of the mind with whose normal operations he is acquainted. He can sometimes trace a connection between his waking thoughts and his dreams, but he frequently realizes that the latter correspond to no possible human experience. At other times, he becomes conscious of the presence of a mental energy, which far transcends that of his normal experience or capacity, a mind which can solve mathematical problems that are beyond the compass of his normal powers. Again, he becomes conscious that his dream intelligence is filled with the most sublime thoughts and is capable of clothing them in the most beautiful and appropriate language that is far beyond his normal linguistic powers. Thoughts which were strangers to his normal consciousness. Sometimes the key to the most profound secrets of nature are thus revealed to him, and are thus made available for normal uses and practical exploitation. Again, dreams often reveal an apparent independence, on the part of the dream intelligence, of the space and time limitations with which one is normally acquainted. Thus, it is not uncommon for one to become aware, by means of dreams, of what is happening to his near relatives and friends who are thousands of miles distant, with no possible means of communication between them through sensory channels. He thus becomes aware that his dream intelligence possesses powers and facilities for receiving and cognizing intelligence from others not possessed by his normal intelligence. These facts alone seem to point to the theory of duality as a rational solution of the phenomena. But when we consider the limitations of the dream intelligence, we find still stronger evidence to the same effect. Thus, we find that it is constantly amenable to control by suggestion. This, too, is within the range of everyone's experience. Everybody is aware that the dream intelligence never realizes the incongruity of the most ridiculously impossible dream situations. No fact of human experience weighs one hair against the suggestions arising from the sensations caused by an overloaded stomach. Reason abdicates her throne in the presence of the vision of one's grandmother sporting 7 heads and 10 horns, and mounted upon a fiery and untamed sawhorse. The dreamer is neither surprised at the conduct of his grandmother nor at the character of her mount, and he never suspects that she is possessed of more than a normal number of heads and horns. It is obvious, therefore, that the dream intelligence is devoid of the power of inductive reasoning, which is but another way of saying that it is controlled by suggestion. In this we find it to be to a very remarkable degree. Thus, in a case cited by Abercrombie, a bottle of hot water at the feet of the dreamer caused him to dream of walking on the warm ground near the crater of Mount Etna. Another, whose bedclothes were accidentally thrown off during the night in a cold room, dreamed of spending the winter at Hudson's Bay and of suffering much from the intense frost. It is needless, however, to multiply cases, as few are exempt from such experiences. These phenomena can be accounted for on no other rational hypothesis than that of duality of mind. Two states of consciousness are certainly in evidence, and the phenomena are radically different, each from the other. So radical, indeed, are the differences in both powers and limitations between the waking and the dream intelligences that we are justified in assuming, for the purposes of a working hypothesis, that there are two separable and therefore distinct intelligences in man's mental organism. That there is a nexus between the two that enables them to act in perfect synchronism when occasion requires is necessarily true. It is to this synchronism of action that we are indebted for what is designated as genius. It is also in evidence on occasions of great importance to the individual, as when danger is imminent or some great crisis is impending. There are other phenomena of dreams of great evidential importance, though less distinctly pointing to duality. The one about to be mentioned exhibits powers of inconceivably rapid mentation possessed by the dream intelligence. Dreams that are induced by percussive sounds, more frequently than any others, display this phenomenon in perfection. Thus, Professor Carpenter, of Boston, relates the following illustrative experience. The professor was at the house of a friend and slept in a bedroom the door of which opened outward into the hall. It stood open during the night, and in the morning someone opened a window at the end of the hall, letting in a draught of air that shut the professor's door with great violence. He instantly awoke, so quickly, in fact, that when fully awake he realized the cause of the concussion. In the meantime, however, he dreamed a dream the events of which would have required nearly a year of time in the happening. It passed during the progress of the late Civil War, and at a time when conscription was the order of the day. He dreamed that the dreaded order came, and his name was on the list. He tried to get it removed, but an examination demonstrated his eligibility, and when the drawing came off, his name, like Abu Benedhim's, led all the rest. He then set to work to hire a substitute. But the fates were against him. When he could get a man, he could not raise the money, and when at last he raised the money, he could not find an eligible man. Finally, he was hustled into a uniform that did not fit, and was then transported to the state rendezvous, where he spent 3 miserable months in drilling in the awkward squad. At the end of that time his regiment was ordered to Washington, where another 3 months was spent in acquiring a military education. He was then ordered to the front, where he was forced to endure the hardships of camp life for an indefinite period. In the midst of his monotonous misery he suddenly became aware that he was in the hottest part of a great battle. He was awakened to the realization of the situation by the sudden firing of a cannon, or the bursting of a shell, in his immediate vicinity. It was the slamming of the door that awoke him at once to a realization of his objective and his subjective surroundings. Abercrombie relates a similar case that happened in Edinburgh at a period when there was an alarm of French invasion, and almost every man in the city was a soldier. All things had been arranged in expectation of the landing of an enemy, the first notice of which was to be given by a gun from the castle. The gentleman to whom the dream occurred, and who had been a most zealous volunteer, was in bed between TV/0 and 3 o'clock in the morning when he dreamed of hearing the signal gun. He was immediately at the castle, witnessed the proceedings for displaying the signals that had been planned for arousing the whole surrounding country, and saw and heard a great bustle over the town from troops and artillery assembling, especially in Prince's Street. At this time he was roused by his wife, who awoke in a fright caused by a similar dream, connected with much noise and the landing of an enemy. The origin of this remarkable concurrence was ascertained, in the morning, to be the noise produced by the fall of a pair of tongs upon the floor above. Many similar cases are related by the old psychologists, some of the dreams involving years of dream time. The salient features of this class of dreams, to which attention is invited, are, first, that the sound that awakens the sleeper is identical with the sound that forms the culminating feature of the dream. This, of course, involves the apparent paradox that the dream commenced after it ended. The paradoxical character of the proposition is, how one the first question that will naturally be asked by the psychical researcher will be, were these concurrent dreams the result of telepathy? The answer is possibly, but not necessarily. It is not even probable, for the reason that both were anticipating the signal gun, and the noise that caused the dreams was the same. Identical causes will always produce like effects, but not necessarily identical in detail, and it is not alleged that the two dreams were identical in detail. In order to make a case for dream telepathy, there should be no common cause, antecedent or immediate. An illustrative case came within the writer's experience. The salient feature of his dream was that he saw a white-faced ox passing through a narrow lane and entering an enclosure. The dream was very vivid, but was totally void of significance, for he was not in the habit of thinking of cattle, much less of possessing any interest in them, and had not consciously had them in his mind for years. Judge of his surprise when his wife related a dream the next morning in which a white-faced ox, passing through a narrow lane and entering an enclosure, was the salient feature. There was absolutely no assignable cause, near or remote, for either dream, and yet they were both dreamed the same night, and a comparison of recollections revealed the fact that the dreams were identical, not only as to the central figure, but as to its environmental details. The triviality of the subject matter adds to its evidential value, for it is thus removed as far as possible from causes involving anticipations, habits of thought, emotional excitation, or waking thoughts immediately antecedent. Ever, at once removed when we consider the peculiar powers and limitations of the dream intelligence or subjective mind. As I have already pointed out, its powers of induction are nil, but its power of correct, logical deduction from suggested premises is potentially perfect. It is obvious that both suggestion and subsequent deduction are involved in this class of dreams. The sound constitutes the suggestion that a gun has been fired, and from this accepted objective fact are deduced, in their order, all its antecedent causes, near and remote. The dreamer's habits of thought in reference to guns serving to give the trend to the deductions. Thus, the sound of a cannon suggested a great battle, which was immediately in evidence. A battle suggested a state of war and incidental camp life, with its accompanying hardships. Camp life suggested antecedent drilling, from which, in turn, were deduced the rendezvous at the national capital, the state rendezvous, the uniform, the conscription, the efforts to avoid it, the draft, etc., back to the beginning of the story. It follows that such dreams run backward, and that they are, therefore, nothing but a series of deductions from a series of suggested premises, beginning with the peripheral stimulus auditory, which set the train in motion. It is, indeed, questionable if all dreams are not made up of series of deductions backward from the causal stimulus. The latter necessarily precedes the dream, as when the removal of the bedclothes on a cold night causes a dream of a whole winter spent in an Arctic climate. Be this as it may, it is evident that when the stimulus lasts but an instant, and begins where the dream story ends, the latter must necessarily consist of a series of deductions as stated. The point, however, to which especial attention is invited is the inconceivable rapidity of mentation involved in dreaming a year-long dream, including an indefinite number of details within an infinitesimal space of time. Thus, the time elapsing between the slamming of Professor Carpenter's door and his awakening to normal consciousness is inappreciable to the objective mind. Yet the dream, with all its details, was conceived within that point of time and strongly impressed upon the mind of waking consciousness. It is obvious that when the two ends of a dream are so close together in point of time, the objective mind, handicapped by its time and space limitations, could not possibly know at which end it commenced. Naturally, it interprets it in terms of its own experience, just as the mind sees objects right side up, although the images cast upon the retina of the eye are always inverted. These wonderful powers thus found to exist inherent in the dream intelligence, together with its equally wonderful limitations, are in such marked contrast with those of normal consciousness that they constitute still further proofs of duality of mind. In fact, a complete analysis of the various classes of the phenomena of dreams would reveal ample evidence of duality, even without the aid of experimental hypnotism. With that aid, it is easy to demonstrate the fact that for all practical purposes, it is a safe hypothesis. Hypnotism, for present purposes, may be considered as a means of stimulating the activity of the dream intelligence or subjective mind, testing its powers and ascertaining its limitations. In other words, hypnotism is a means by which dreams can be induced, controlled, and experimented with. It is to the human soul what the scalpel is to the human body. It is the instrument by which the soul can be dissected and its mysteries explored for the benefit of science. As the scalpel in unskilled hands may be made an instrument of destruction, so may hypnotism in the hands of ignorance or charlatanism be made the instrument of untold evil to both body and soul. In the hands of the skilled and conscientious scientist, hypnotism may be, and has been, the instrument of scientific investigation of the problems of the human soul. It has rescued psychology from the domain of speculative philosophy and made it an experimental, inductive science. It has invaded the realms of superstition and destroyed the food upon which it has battened throughout all the ages of mankind. It has done this by revealing man to himself. It found in man a living soul. It segregated it from its objective environment, mental and physical, and analyzed its powers and revealed its limitations. And, paradoxical as it may seem, it found, in both its powers and its seeming limitations, indubitable evidence of its divine origin and of its immortality. All this it did, and much more, by the simple process of inducing in the subject a profound sleep, and then proceeding to experiment with that wonderful intelligence which, as we have seen, is most familiarly manifested to us in our dreams. Duality was thus demonstrated by proving that the highest distinctive powers of each mind were manifested only when the powers of the other were inhibited. Besides, the fact that they are segregable at all is sufficient evidence of duality, to say nothing of the distinctive powers and limitations of each. It is, in fact, only by means of these distinctive powers that we are enabled to know that they are segregable or when segregation has been accomplished. That is to say, were it not for the distinctive powers, one mind or state of consciousness would be a mere duplication of the other, differing, perhaps, in degrees of power, but not in kind. In that case, the trance condition, spontaneous or induced, would be a mere exaltation of the objective powers, a hyperesthesia of the physical senses. Braid, indeed, attempted to show that the phenomena of mind-reading could all be thus accounted for. But later as well as earlier experimentation demonstrated the contrary, and not only firmly established telepathy upon a scientific basis, but definitely located the power in the subjective mind. This wonderful power, together with others not necessary to enumerate in this connection, served to differentiate the two minds or states of consciousness so clearly that duality became a hypothetical necessity. And what is true of the distinctive powers of the subjective mind may be repeated with multiplied emphasis with reference to its limitations. Of these, the one which particularly interests the student of mental therapeutics is its constant amenability to control by the subtle power of suggestion. This subject, however, must be reserved for treatment in subsequent chapters. It is sufficient for present purposes to note the fact that suggestibility, in the psychic sense, is a limitation pertaining exclusively to the subjective mind. The objective mind is hedged about by no such limitation, nor by anything remotely akin to it. It is mentioned here merely as one of the psychological discoveries of experimental hypnotism which swells the volume of evidence for duality of mind. It is entirely safe to say that not one fact has yet been brought to light, by the psychological experts of this or any other age, that disproves, or tends to disprove, the fundamental fact of the dual character of man's mental organism. It is equally safe to aver that there is not one fact or phenomenon within the whole range of the physical sciences that disproves, or tends to disprove, the fact of duality. In one of my former works, I collated a series of facts showing that experimental surgery had demonstrated the fact of duality. In another work, I brought the undisputed and indisputable facts of organic evolution to bear upon the same subject with the same result. The discussion cannot be repeated here for obvious reasons. I can only say, in conclusion of this branch of the subject, that if the facts of psychology proper fail to convince, the facts of the physical sciences demonstrate the essential truth of my first proposition that man is endowed with a dual mind, objective and subjective.